and the believer to think, Dr. Ravi Zacharias.
When Bishop Long came to the room before we came here, he told me he'd been at 3 meetings already today, and he said the hard part of it was that it was a breakfast meeting, a lunch meeting, and a dinner meeting. So I reminded him of one of my friends who said he knew of a preacher who stood up once and said, "I'm feeling very tired, so if you don't mind, I would like to sit down and speak." And somebody from the audience said, "We're feeling very tired too, if you don't mind, we'd like to lie down and listen." So I've not been at a breakfast, lunch, and dinner meeting, and so don't lie down and listen. I hope you'll stay awake. My gratitude to the Cathy family and Chick-fil-A. As Baba Cathy was already introduced to you, I saw a sign this week that really humored me. It said Friday at Chick-fil-A was Cow Appreciation Day. And I told him we've been doing that in India for centuries. So we were glad they joined in for just one Friday. I was delighted to be part of this gathering and having them host it. And also, actually, the planning for some of this began at a wellness center in Alpharetta called Jeevan. Jeevan in Hindi means life. And I've had an awful lot of back troubles. I've got 2 metal rods that hold me up. From L3 to S1, I'm bolted down with 8 screws. I go to Home Depot to get a manual to check up on my back, see how it's doing. But the people at Jeevan have done a marvelous job with their oils from India, which they have used for me and brought me an immense amount of relief. And Marjay and the others have been there, and I understand some of their oils are here, and they're doing that to promote that wellness place through which many needy people are touched, not just physically, but those also materially in need are part of the vision of Jeevan. So when I saw these 2 groups coming together and they asked me to come and speak, I was happy to do it. And Bishop Long, thank you for hosting me and coming to this place. But I have to say to you, it's a bit tough because you've got Michael Landon Jr. here, and Michael's a dear friend, and we've got Art Franklin, both of them from the media. I have almost nothing to do with the media. I can barely spell some of the words they use, but I'm speaking on the subject, and they are then going to pitch in their wisdom in the forum afterwards and in the panel. So I would suggest to you, save all your tough questions for them. I will just create the questions for you, and they can in turn answer it. But on the other hand, there is an advantage to not being immersed in it. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, if you want to know what water is, don't ask the fish. If you want to know what water is, don't ask the fish. Because sometimes you are so immersed in an idea or a perspective that you do not even have a counter perspective by which you can judge the perspective within which you live. So in that sense, this is a tremendous combination for us to be here looking at it from the outside, and for these 2 men to be here looking at it from the inside. Michael Landon, of course, very conversant and well-versed with the Hollywood scene, having been raised in a home where acting and entertainment was the primary vogue of literally making a living and earning support for a family, and Art Franklin from the news side of it. So it's a tremendous combination, because the media is really a combination of information dissemination, while at the same time it avoids sometimes the logic of reason and can enter through the back door of the imagination. This is an incredible opportunity for you to bring your questions to men like that and have them interact with you on the subjects that we have on hand. I'm going to present my talk to you in the time that is allotted, and you're going to have to listen very carefully, because if you miss a logical connection, you'll wonder how I got to where I did, and the media might become a relief to you rather than listening to this, and that's really not what we want to happen. I want to present to you a line of argument and a line of discussion here. Let me bring to you 3 introductory remarks about how we approach this subject, and then move to what the media actually does in your life and mine. Now, one of the difficulties with this is trying to fathom of a genuine analysis when in many ways we are all locked into the scene. My children sometimes will take me to a movie, and I'm not much of a moviegoer, frankly. I'm a reader. And in the middle of the movie, some horrible language would be used. And one of them would just look at the other embarrassed, and when we came out of there, one of them would say, "Dad, I promise you, when we saw it the first time, we didn't even notice that those words were used in there." Amazing, isn't it? That generation will hear it and not really hear it. And all of a sudden, somebody is sitting there that makes them a little uncomfortable. It's a little bit like the policeman driving by and you suddenly check your seatbelt. You didn't think of it prior to that little red light flashing in your rearview mirror. But that's the problem we have. One of my friends, actually, he's represented here tonight, he had a heart attack many years ago. And I remember him saying to me as a medical doctor, he said, "You know, the difference between a heart attack and any other pain I describe in these words. If my arm is hurting, I say to you, my arm is in pain. If my foot is hurting, I'll say my foot is in pain." It is as if there is a disconnect between that what I'm referring to and myself. It is the appendage that I'm talking about, my arm or my foot. He said, when I was having a heart attack, and in the throes of that heart attack, the only way for me to describe it is that I was in the pain. He says, I was not having a pain, I was gobbled up, swallowed up by the pain. The very instrument that was intended to generate life instead was pulsating out pain impulses. And so when we talk about the media, in so many ways, we are the product of it. We are not talking about an appendage to our lives. We are talking about something that has actually produced us. No more illustration would be needed for that than even the recent tragic death of Michael Jackson. And watching the entire emotion and the trauma of it having created by the loss of a life that died prematurely and the life that was principally involved in entertaining the younger generation from some years ago. The power of that life through sheer entertainment and talent and gift. How do we proceed? Let me give the backdrop in the following ways. Some years ago, the Justice Minister of Israel, he was the Justice Minister at that time, once upon a time a political prisoner of the former Soviet Union, Natan Sharansky, went back to Russia to visit the prison where he'd been incarcerated in solitary confinement for so long for his political dissent. When Mr. Sharansky came to Russia and asked to go to the prison, his wife accompanied him, but just as they reached that solitary confining room, he said to his wife, "Would you please stay outside for just a moment? I want to go in alone." He said, "Because in the years that I spent there, I found myself for the first time." And he went into that dark room with the door locked again, only knowing a few minutes later he'd be let out. And when he came out, he said to the people standing there, he said, "This is where, alone in the darkness, I found myself. And I want you to take me now to the grave of Andrei Sakharov, the physicist who gave the Soviet Union the atomic bomb." So from that prison, he went to the grave of Sakharov and laid a wreath. There was a connection in his mind. Nobody else could see it. And here's what he said. He said, "For all the years that I was here, I had thought that the most powerful weapon in the world was the atomic bomb. He said, Sakharov changed my mind. One day he looked me in the eye and he said, Nathan, the most powerful weapon in the world is not the atomic bomb. The most powerful weapon in the world is the truth." The most powerful weapon in the world is not the atomic bomb. The most powerful weapon in the world is the truth. And as I present to you tonight this conversation on how it is that we see and understand the nature of truth, I want to give to you some ideas that I think we in this arena need to understand. It was Winston Churchill who added a new twist to it during the World War. He said the most valuable thing in the world is the truth. In fact, it is so valuable that it is often covered by a bodyguard of lies. The most valuable thing in the world is the truth. It is so valuable, in fact, that it is often covered by a bodyguard of lies. My favorite author, Malcolm Muggeridge, gave us two statements about the truth that give me a bridge to my talk. Listen to what he says. Truth is very beautiful, more so I consider than justice, today's pursuit which easily puts on a false face. In the nearly 7 decades I have lived through, the world has overflowed with bloodshed and explosions, whose dust have never had time to settle before others have erupted, all in supposedly just causes. The quest for justice continues, and the weapons of hatred have piled up. But truth was an early casualty. The lies on behalf of which our wars have been fought and our peace treaties concluded. The lies of revolution and counter-revolution, the lies of advertising, the lies of the news, the lies of salesmanship, of politics, the lies of the priest often in his pulpit, the professor at his podium, the journalist at his typewriter. The lie seems to be stuck like a fishbone in the throat of the microphone. The handheld lies of the prowling cameraman. Ignatius Salone told me once how when he was a member of the old Comintern, some stratagem was under discussion, and a delegate, a newcomer who had never attended before, made the extraordinary observation that if such and such a statement were to be released, it ought not to be released because it wouldn't be true. There was a moment of dazed, stunned silence, and then everybody began to laugh. They laughed and laughed till tears ran down their cheeks and the Kremlin walls began to shake. The same laughter echoes in every council chamber and cabinet room. Wherever 2 or more are gathered together to exercise authority, it seems as though it is truth that has died, not God. And then he goes on to say this. In this Sargasso sea of fantasy and fraud, how can I or anyone else hope to swim unencumbered? How can I learn to see through and not with the eye? How can I take off my own motley and wash away my makeup? How can I raise the iron shutter and put out the studio lights? How do I silence the sound effects and put the cameras to sleep? Can I really watch the sun rise on Sunset Boulevard and set over Forest Lawn? Can I find real furniture among the studio props, silence in a discotheque, love in a striptease? Can I read truth off an auto cue and catch it on a screen or chase it on the wings of Muzak? Can I view it in living color with the news, hear it in living sound along the motorways? No, not in the wind that rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks, not in the earthquake that followed, nor in the fire that followed the earthquake, but it is in that still small voice, not in the screeching of tires either, or the grinding of brakes, or the roar of jets, or the whistle of sirens, not in the howl of trombones, the rattle of drums, or the chanting of demo voices. Again and again and again, I'm reminded it's that still small voice, the voice of God, if I can only catch it. That comes from Muggeridge. He was a media man. He lived with the plasticity of news and entertainment. And so on the one hand, he tells you that the lie seems to be stuck like a fishbone in the throat of the microphone. And in the other, he tells you that our entire entertainment world seems so plastic and so artificial. Can I hear real music on Muzak? Can I catch it in the noise around? Can I see real furniture? He says, no, it's not in all the sound and hustle and bustle and all of this. If one can only hear the still small voice, the voice of God, if one can only catch it. So I give to you the medium in its instrumentality with the backdrop of the reminder that truth is the most valuable thing in the world and the most powerful. But now I come to the theological backdrop of it. Isn't it interesting? There are two passages in Scripture, one in the Old and one in the New, that give me my connection here. In the Old Testament, if you go to the book of Genesis and read chapter 11, you'll see the whole issue of the Tower of Babel being built. Let us do this, let us do that, let us build ourselves a big name. Humanity was seeing itself as having all the audacity and pompousness of power and the localization of all of that in the city. And the Bible says that if cupidity became the motive here, unity would become destructive to civilization, and God came down and confused their languages, because unity is the worst thing you can have when self-aggrandizement is the goal. And you move to the New Testament, and in the New Testament you see an incredible situation where the enemy of our souls comes to encounter Jesus. First he tells him, why don't you do something great? Turn these stones into bread, and the whole world will follow you. And Jesus says, no, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Satan comes with his second round of appeal. He said, doesn't it also say that he will give his angels charge over you? Why don't you jump and see if he will honor his word? And Jesus turns to him and says, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. And now comes the final assault. It's the assault upon the imagination, as Satan says to him, I will give you all of the kingdoms of this world if you shall bow down and worship me. And Jesus says, no, you shall worship the Lord your God alone, and him only shall you serve. The first temptation comes to the intellect. The second temptation comes to the will. Both of them failed. He figured his last hope was to come in through the imagination, because the imagination tantalizes you and brings you into a realm of analysis that can be so flawed when reason and will have already been bypassed. And so you see the backdrop of the instrument. You see the backdrop of theology. And now I bring to you the backdrop of history. For thousands of years, we lived with an oral tradition. Ideas were passed on orally. Then around 2 millennium BC, we became an alphabet civilization and became a scribal culture. In the mid-1400s, we had Gutenberg invent his movable type, and the printing press was brought into being. And after Gutenberg had brought that press about, things changed. We actually became a print culture. In fact, it is fascinating. In the year 2000, when Time magazine sent out its survey to hundreds of thousands of people, who was the greatest figure of the millennium, Gutenberg came in as number one, because of the work of print and printing press. Then in the mid-1830s, when photography came about, and in the late 1800s, when it was discovered that light could be converted into electrical impulses, cover a lot of distances, and then transmitted over that distance into an image and a picture, television became common fare. And today, the average 18-year-old spends 3 times as much in front of a television as he or she does in school. That now is the impact of our times and our generation. So the backdrop of truth, the backdrop of theology with the reality of the word against counter perspectives, and now the visual and the picture with which we live. So I want to present to you 3 dangers with which we live right now in the media world, and I want to discuss them with you later on as we talk about as we come to a question and answer time. The first is this: the problem as I see it with the media and its instrumentality is that it will always have a problematic induction. It will always have a problematic induction. When you induce something, it leads you to deduce something. And when you look really at the nature of the media today, it actually has an appeal which is quite opposite to what truth has in its own appeal. Let me read this for you. I think you'll find this absolutely fascinating. Malcolm Muggeridge, in his book, Christ and the Media, if you have never read that book, get that book. It's hard to track now because it'll only be available in used bookstores. It is the finest treatment of the media I have ever seen. Malcolm Muggeridge says this. Let me quote some words by Simone Weil. In my opinion, one of the most luminous intelligences of our time. Words which I have often meditated upon and which are very relevant to my subject. He's quoting Simone Weil now. Nothing is so beautiful. Nothing is so continually fresh and surprising, so full of sweet and perpetual ecstasy as the good. No desert is so dreary, monotonous, and boring as evil. But in our fantasy, it's the other way around. Fictional good is boring and flat, while fictional evil is varied, intriguing, attractive, and full of charm. These words were written a decade or so before television had been developed to attract its huge audiences all over the world, becoming the greatest fabricator and conveyor of fantasy that has ever existed. The offerings of television seem to me to bear out the point Simone Weil makes to a remarkable degree. For in television, it is invariably eros rather than agape that provides all the excitement. Celebrity and success rather than a broken and a contrite heart that are held up as being preeminently desirable. Jesus Christ on lights on Broadway, a superstar, rather than Jesus Christ on the cross who gets a folk hero's billing. Good and evil, after all, provide the basic theme of drama for our mortal existence, and in this sense may be compared with the positive and negative points which generate an electric current. Transpose the points, the current fails, lights go out, darkness falls, and all is confusion. So it has become with us. The transposition of good and evil in the world of fantasy created by the media leaves us with no sense of any moral order in the universe, and without this, no order whatsoever, social, political, economic, or any other is ultimately available. There is attainable. There is only chaos. Now, to break out of this fantasy, to rediscover the reality of good and evil, and the order which informs all creation, this is the freedom that the incarnation has made available to us. Do you hear what he said? That when you see the media as you see it today, in reality, nothing is so beautiful as the good. Nothing is so monotonous and boring as evil. He says, but with our imagination, it's the other way around. Fictional good is boring and flat. Fictional evil is varied, intriguing, attractive, and full of charm. Once you understand this, you will understand the predicament we face with an instrument that is cold and has to warm itself up so that it draws the attention of the audience. Have you ever watched a child watching TV? The child can be playing with the blocks, and all of a sudden, somebody with a knife or a sword is cutting a human body apart, and the child stops and watches what is going on. Or you watch that child playing with blocks, and suddenly there's a horrific, sensual scene. And the child stops and starts watching. You see, in reality, nothing is so beautiful as the good. Nothing is so monotonous and boring and flat as evil, but in our imagination, it's the other way around. Fictional good is boring and flat. Fictional evil is varied, intriguing, attractive, and full of charm. So the medium lends itself to the warming of itself up to attract your imagination and mine. I'll get to the positive side of it too, but I want you to hear me on the downside and the dark side of it. People like Michael Landon and all are trying to change this desperately. The movies that he's trying to produce, the stories that he's trying to tell, these are the bright lights in a rather grim and a dark scene. If you don't believe this, let me tell you something that might scare you that shocked me. I was overseas recently when a very famous actor had breakfast with me. I won't name him. He's an Academy Award-winning actor. He had just produced a film, and he was in the country of Thailand and on his way to Hong Kong to try to market it. Do you know why he was marketing it there? And let me quote what he said to me. He said, "When I sent this script and sent this production to Hollywood, I got a reply back in one line: we cannot accept this. There's not a single bit of violence in this movie." I said, "Are you telling me?" I shared that story with Michael. I said, "Are you telling me the truth?" He said, "That's it." I said, "What's Hollywood on, a death wish?" He said, "It seems to be." Now, here's what I want you to nail down when I'm talking about this whole issue of a problematic induction. You know, when you go to the Old Testament and you come to the New Testament, there are two classic passages that we know provide for us the boundaries, one for law and the other for happiness. In the Ten Commandments, no other God, no graven image, no name in vain, the Sabbath to be holy, honor your father and mother, not to steal, not to bear false witness, not to covet. All of these, what is the bottom line of the Ten Commandments? If you were to take the Ten Commandments and put it down in a simple statement, it is this: life at its core is sacred. That's the word writ large. And when the Constitution was signed in America, those signatories to the Constitution said this: we put our name to this document with our sacred honor. Don't tell me there wasn't a transcendental motif to the signing and the institution of this very nation. We put our names to this with our sacred honor. It is not a secular honor. It is not a profane honor. It is a sacred honor. So you go to the Old Testament and you see in the parameters of the Ten Commandments, life at its core is sacred. You come to the New Testament and the great sermon is in the Sermon on the Mount. And what are the Beatitudes telling us? It tells us, blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are they that mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are you when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. What is the core word of this? Your happiness lies in honoring the kingdom of God. So the objective moral law and the imperative with him. And ladies and gentlemen, we come right back to this. The most sacred thing in the end is the truth. And so when you go to the media, you start off with a problematic induction. Secondly, you move to a devastating seduction. A devastating seduction. A couple of weeks ago, I had the honor of delivering the major address of the United Kingdom's prayer breakfast at the Palace of Westminster, the House of Lords, House of Commons represented. And one of the members of the House of Lords there was David Putnam. David Putnam produced the famed movie Chariots of Fire and others. Here's what David Putnam says: far more than any other influence in my life, more than school, and actually even more than my home, my attitudes, my dreams, my preconceptions and preconditions for life had been irreversibly shaped 5,500 miles away in a place called Hollywood. I labor over all of this in order to explain exactly where my passion for cinema stems from, exactly why it hurts me that the movies so frequently sell themselves short, unable or unwilling to step up to the creative ethical standards the audience is entitled to expect from them. The medium is too powerful and too important an influence on the way we live and the way we see ourselves to be left solely to the tyranny of the box office or reduced to the sum of the lowest common denominator in public taste. This public taste or appetite being conditioned by a diet capable only of producing mental and emotional malnutrition. Movies are powerful, good or bad, that they tinker inside your brain. They steal up on you in the darkness of the cinema to form or confirm social attitudes. They can help to create a healthy, informed, concerned, and inquisitive society, or in the alternative, a negative, apathetic, ignorant one, merely a short step away from nihilism and despair. In short, believe me, cinema is propaganda. He says that. Benign or malign, social or antisocial, the factual nature of cinema and its responsibility cannot be avoided. To an almost alarming degree, our political and emotional responses rest for their health in the quality and the integrity of the present and future generation of film and television creators. Accepting this fact, there are only two personal madnesses that filmmakers must guard against. One is the belief that they can do everything, and the other is the belief that they can do nothing. The former is arrogant in the extreme, but the latter is plainly irresponsible and totally unacceptable. When you raise your son or daughter today, you are facing a dangerous assault on the imagination of your youngster. More and more people will tell you that a lot of what you you face in your adult years may have happened when you were a young child. And I shudder to think of what happens to young children today with all that goes on in the versions and perversions of entertainment. The tragedy today of pornography. I have seen homes wrecked because of pornography. I've seen young marriages break up because a man has had an image planted in his mind that he can never fulfill, and no human being can fulfill it. He's got an idea. I was speaking at a graduate school of theology in a city and country I'll leave unnamed. I never addressed this subject. I'm not an authority on it. But something had happened recently where I'd talked to a young couple whose marriage was shattered over this because the young boy had gotten involved in porn from the time he was 12. I didn't even know what hardcore porn was. When they started describing it to me, I said, stop. And my traveling associate was with me and the 2,000 plus students in front of me at a graduate school. I spoke on that for about 5 or 6 minutes and moved on with the rest of the message. It was on the theme of drawing the lines. At the end, when I gave the invitation, I'm not kidding you, I promise you this, every aisle was full of young men kneeling, and most of them were sobbing their hearts out. They had already gotten themselves into a mess and didn't know how to extricate themselves from it. These were young men going into the ministry. The seducing power of this is almost demonic, where it creates in you the hunger of a feeling that no person can fulfill. Beware. With all of the knowing that we get to know and all of the knowledge that increases, there are insidious forces at work that can wipe out tens of thousands of lives, and nobody's accountable anymore. So we've got a problematic induction, a devastating seduction. And in that seduction, what it is that happens, you move to an inevitable reduction. Everything comes down at the end to nothing more than materiality, and the spiritual is violated in the process. Philosophy has moved to the existential. Art has moved to the sensual. Education has moved to the skeptical. Spirituality has moved to the mystical. And truth has been dislocated now and resides only in the individual. That's it. philosophy to the existential, art to the sensual, truth to the individual, spirituality to the mystical. And education has gone to the skeptical. You can't believe anything anymore. We've reduced everything. Everything has been reduced. And I want to try and pull this together in application as best as I can. And I want you to really try and nail this down in your minds now. You move from a problematic induction where you are given ideas that have no context, and then they lead you to something devoid of a context. Can I take a step back on that for a moment? I was flying from Delhi to Newark, New Jersey. It's a 14-and-a-half-hour non-stop flight. You celebrate a few birthdays along the way. And while I was flying there, then sitting next to me was an anchor from a major network. I won't name the anchor for the network for you. I knew who he was. He didn't know that I knew who he was. So we just started talking, and he found out what I did and so on. Finally, he started talking about his news network, and I finally said to him, I really don't watch your network anymore. He said, you don't? I said, no. I said, you guys distort everything. And when you have got doors closed and you've still got about 11 hours on the flight, there's no place to go. He said, why do you say that? I said, I've seen the world and I've seen your stories. You guys latch on to one slender thread of one story or one little finger, and you think you've grabbed the fist of reality. I'll give you a couple of examples. I told him that. And I gave him those examples. I said, do you know what news actually stands for? He didn't. North, east, west, and south. It's the context of total news. I said, and the news you sometimes give is so distorted that actually it ruins my day when I watch it in the morning, so I don't anymore. I'd rather listen to some inspiring songs and get to work. I have to say to you, he was a real gentleman. He was listening very quietly, very patiently. He said, what kind of work do you do? So I told him, most of my work is dealing with people's questions, shattered lives, broken dreams, no answers, no context. I said to him, any text without a context becomes a pretext. We finished chatting, and I gave him the examples of the stories that I felt were thoroughly distorted in their news and actually ended up costing people's lives. We got off in Newark. I'm telling you the truth. I went over to the carousel waiting for my bags to come. He was on this side of the carousel. The plane had unloaded now, a lot of people. I was on the other side. He came over, took his wallet out, gave me his card. He said, Mr. Zacharias, you know what the problem is? He said, you travel, you see, and so you know. We basically entertain people who don't travel and don't see and don't know. I said, and the net result is a manufactured reality that doesn't measure up against the facts. Art Franklin and I, we were talking before, as with Michael. This is not a slam. This is a plea. Don't live with sound bites. Read. Read. Get the story. Get the facts. Get the footnotes. Understand what the bigger picture is. You can't judge a picture by just one little spot on the canvas. It's like us. We love to sing verses 1, 3, and 5 when the songwriter wrote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How would you like it if you wrote a book and they read pages 1, 7, 9, 11, and 13, and said, I've read the book? But that's what we do. We want, someone said we want sermonettes for the Christianettes. We want it quick. We want it short. We want it brief. And so if the news cannot tell you about the world in 30 minutes, you don't want it. I say to you, the inevitable reduction that takes place because of the induction and seduction. I want to bring this to a close. You know, Elvis Presley's half-brother lives in Georgia. He asked if he could come and spend a morning and an afternoon with me. And I was really flattered and honored by it, because I was a great Elvis fan when I was a teenager. Bought up all the records. When Elvis Presley died in 1977, I was in the Philippines speaking, and very saddened by it. I think he was one of the great performers and had a great voice, especially with his record on the hymns I loved. And his brother sat across the table from me and we chatted, and I said, "Can you tell me something?" I said, "I've always wanted to know, how come a man who had so much fame, power, money, success, how did he allow himself to be destroyed by drugs?" Do you know what he told me? He said, "Drugs didn't kill Elvis." I said, "Didn't?" He said, "No." He said, "Fame did." He said, "Fame killed him. And when he saw his fame disappearing before his eyes, he resorted to drugs to tranquilize his own loss of identity. In the process, he was gone." You and I sit in front of the screen and think these people are icons. They go back home at night and needed drugs to wake them up, drugs to put them to sleep, drugs to perform, because they were made into somebody that they were never intended to be made into. But the seduction of the camera. And so I want to close with this. A problematic induction, that deadly seduction, and the inevitable reduction. What happens? And with this I close. Please follow me very carefully now. C.S. Lewis made this comment in one of his books that he calls A Pilgrim's Regress. He doesn't call it A Pilgrim's Progress. And the reason he calls it A Pilgrim's Regress is because in his journey through atheism and pantheism and skepticism and nihilism and all of that, he kept searching and searching till he finally found Christ. He said, "I don't know why I rejected everything else along the way, but I knew it didn't fit till I found Christ, so I took a regressive journey because now I had the answer to explain why I'd rejected everything else." And so C.S. Lewis talks about this time along his journey in an allegory, A Pilgrim's Regress. He refers to himself as young John. And as young John, he comes to the mountain called the Spirit of the Age, and he pictures the man heading the Spirit of the Age as kind of a grim Neronian factor who stared down upon the inhabitants of the Spirit of the Age. Isn't it interesting? He did not see it as pleasure or laughter, but grim and austere. And he pictures himself as handcuffed in this mountain. And then comes the waiter and offers him his breakfast, unclasps his hands and gives him the tray, the waiter representing the Spirit of the Age. And he says to him, "Have some milk." And Lewis takes a sip of this milk and says, "Ah, what nourishing, nutritious milk." Hold that in your mind for just a moment, because I want to come to it. When Larry Flynt, the pornographer, was being tried for pornography here in Atlanta, the lawyer defending him made an incredible argument. He would bring the witness onto the courtroom scene and would quiz the witness. And he would say this to the witness: "Have you ever gone into an art gallery?" "Yes, sir." "Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery?" "Yes, sir." "Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery where there are paintings of unclad people, naked people, by the grand masters?" "Yeah, I suppose so." "Will you please tell this jury why you paid to go into an art gallery where there were paintings of people in that gallery without any clothes on, and you call that art, and you call my client stuff pornography? Would you explain that to the jury?" He had him. he had him. I thought to myself, what would I say? Of course, they don't get philosophical in a witness stand, you know. But if I sat with that attorney opposite a coffee table, I'd say something like this to him. Do you know when Michelangelo started to paint people without clothes on, his teacher looked at him and said, Michael, why are you doing this? And Michelangelo said, because I want to see man as God sees man. And the teacher looked at him and said, but Michael, you're not God. 1 point. Second point, I would tell him the story of Lewis going through the journey, and he's given the tray of breakfast, and the waiter says to him, here's a glass of milk, drink it. So he drinks it and says, what nutritious, delicious milk, John says. And the waiter says, John, I knew you would say that. Nutritious, delicious milk? Do you know it's just the secretion of a cow? Like its urine? It secretes urine, it secretes milk. You call this nourishing, you call that garbage. And John clasps his ears. Then he made the mistake of commenting on the eggs and how nutritious the eggs were. And he makes an even more bizarre analogy to John of what an egg actually is. And John doesn't know how to handle it. He's rebound again, and the waiter leaves. And then Lewis says this, reason came riding on a horse and rescued me and said to the mountain, the spirit of the age, sir, you lie. You don't know the difference between what nature's meant for nourishment and what nature's meant for garbage. You don't know the difference between what nature's meant for nourishment and what nature's meant for garbage. What I want to say to you is this. If entertainment continues the way it is entertaining us today, we will lose the difference between what nature's meant for nourishment and what nature's meant for garbage. We will not know the difference between what is sacred and what is profane. We find two things having one thing in common, and therefore we think they have everything in common, which is not true. And so the challenge to the world of media, and men like Michael and Art to respond to it positively that way, is this. There's a beautiful song, and I quote and bring it to close. Many times, I put this on in my car by the famed tenor Kenneth McKellar, and I listen to this song. I wish I could sing it for you, but you'd wish a different kind of media. Here's the way this song goes. Seated one day at the organ, I was weary and ill at ease, and my fingers wandered idly over the noisy keys. I know not what I was playing or what I was dreaming then, when I touched one chord of music like the sound of a great amen. It flooded the crimson twilight like the close of an angel's psalm. It lay on my fevered spirit like the touch of infinite calm. It quieted pain and sorrow like love overcoming strife. It seemed the harmonious echo o'er our discordant life. It linked all perplexed meanings into one perfect peace and trembled away into silence as if it were loath to cease. I have sought, but I seek it vainly, that one lost chord divine which came from the soul of the organ and entered into mine. It may be that death's bright angel will speak in that chord again. It may be that only in heaven I shall hear that grand amen. Music is a beautiful thing. There are chords that God can play it with. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard neither has entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for them that love him. My prayer is, to you young people especially, that you will get into the media and change the status quo. Bring us the music, bring us the stories, bring us the pictures, bring us the beauty that will lift our minds to the highest, that will only be consummated in heaven. And it may be only in heaven we will have that grand amen. But we can have lots of hints of it now when it is done right, for God is also the God of the visual, and he wants us to glorify him in whatever we think, speak, or say. And so between the problematic induction, the devastating seduction, and the inevitable reduction, may we come to him who is the author of creation and the ultimate resident of what heaven is all about, who wants us to understand beauty, harmony, and the picture that he paints in your life. You are a work of art, and he is the artist. Get into the world and change the way art is done and make a difference. God bless you.